The History of Western Immoren, Part 4, The Thousand Cities Era. The spread of the Mennonite faith and the defeat of the Mulgore allowed for the rapid spread of civilization across the plains, hills, forests, and coasts of Western Immoren. Every fertile plot of ground or marginally defensible hillock was seized by the ambitious warlords of the time. This ushered in an era no less torn by strife, but bringing in many advancements. The settled peoples of this era had the luxury of ample food and shelter, as well as trade with neighbors, at least when they weren't at war. The battles of this era were not those between civilizations in the wilderness, but instead between rival city-states. The spread of shipping and commerce also gave rise to new professions, as well as dangers, with influential merchants as well as pirates and bandits preying on citizens of the day. In the growing towns and cities, varied strata of society emerged, giving rise to those who dedicate their lives to crafts other than farming or war. Across western Immoren, 1,000 petty fiefdoms and strongholds sprang up, each a fortified township, led by a ruler who sought to unite the surrounding settlements and both protect and exploit them. By tradition, these rulers sought the blessing of Mennonite priests to legitimize these claims. Soon conquest and diplomacy saw the weaker fiefdoms crushed or uniting, paving the way for fewer but stronger kingdoms, each vying for domination. By the end of this era, less than a dozen strong nations had cowed and consolidated most of the rest. For all the changes that this era marked, it is remembered most with the rise of the twins, a brother and sister from Caspia who would exceed mortal limitations and carve very different paths to enlightenment before ascending to divinity. Ascendancy of the twins. Morrow and Thamar were born in 1930 BR. The exact events of their early lives is shrouded in uncertainty. The little that is known comes from the combined writings which were assembled into the Enchiridion, the holy texts of the Moravian faith, and from accounts of their followers. Whatever their upbringing, Morrow and Thamar were brilliant and radical thinkers whose teachings would redefine the world as those who came after. By the end of the Warlord era, the Mennonite faith was unquestionably dominant. Chains of unbreakable spiritual fealty connected every human being to their Creator, and the true law governed all aspects of their life. Mennonite priests advised kings and sometimes governed their townships, and it fell to the scrutator caste to enforce the rule of law. After death, the souls of the faithful would be governed by priests in the city of man. Though civilization had come to Immoren, for the majority, this meant servitude at the hands of spiritual tyrants. Morrow was raised as a Mennonite and respected the lawgiver for the gifts that fostered civilization, yet he questioned how the true law was interpreted, and in particular, he challenged the tyranny of the priesthood. Thamar was even more extreme in her hatred of the Mennonite priesthood. Historians have surmised that the twins' parents may have been executed by scrutators, giving rise to their shared resentment. Their respective teachings proved to be a tremendous subversion. From as early as 1905 BR, the influence of their writings could be seen across the intellectual community of Caspia and beyond. Morrow served as a soldier for a decade of his early life, and he wrote the horrors of war and the challenges of finding honor in the darkest of moments. He was an orator beyond compare, as well as a charismatic leader, and spoke wherever he traveled, first in the streets of Caspia, and later on pilgrimages abroad. He took time to lend aid to the lesser fortunate, particularly those suffering from lasting injuries, disease, or famine, and gained a reputation as a healer and a worker of miracles. Morrow's path to enlightenment, and the questions he would leave for later generations, emphasized the pursuit of a greater good. He believed living a good life required more than just obeying the true law, such as benevolence, mercy, compassion, and self-sacrifice. He postulated that through reflection and deep understanding of the world, that a person could transcend the flesh, unlocking the limitless potential of the immortal soul. This power then could be wielded for the betterment of all. Although at the outset Morrow and Thamar shared certain beliefs, their paths divided and became opposed. Both believed in questioning Menite authority and seeking enlightenment, but Thamar did not agree this required self-sacrifice. Rather, she asserted unlocking the potential of the human soul required absolute freedom, physical, mental, and spiritual. For her, the betterment of mankind required each person to find individual strength and to rise above those who lack the will. Thamar had a hunger for knowledge and came to believe that the human mind could perceive the very fabric of reality and thereby shape it. In her quest for enlightenment, she immersed herself in the occult, seeking mastery of the spirit of the supernatural and the ineffable, including unholy and forbidden lore. She learned to speak every tongue and consumed tomes and scrolls with a voracious appetite. While Morrow's teachings would take root and eventually be embraced as an established society, Thamar was looked to by radical thinkers and outcasts, as well as those seeking freedom from tyranny. The twins' respective cults and writings came to the attention of the scrutators across the South, who initiated a campaign to eradicate their influence. Their followers were seized, tortured, and then executed by being racked or burned alive. Hearing of this persecution, Morrow and Thamar reconciled and put out a call to all those who suffered under Menite rule. Thousands saw this as their chance to repay the priesthood for countless excesses. The gathering thongs became an army that marched on Caspia in 1900 BR. The priest king of that city, Hierarch Helatius, met with them with his own zealous soldiers, confident that the Creator was on his side. Amid the battle, Morrow fought the priest king personally, eventually disarming him and demanding his surrender. Thamar intervened to impale the unarmed priest with her spear before he could answer. Morrow vowed she would answer for this act after the battle was won. This was the beginning of an irreconcilable divide. As soon as the remaining Menite army was set aside and the twins had their victory, the pair were welcomed into Caspia as heroes. Morrow was urged to rule the city and guide its people, a responsibility he reluctantly accepted, hoping to put his principles into practice. The Enchiridion speaks of this time as a difficult ordeal, when Morrow faced dilemmas for which there were no easy solutions. His writings admit to mistakes made in these years and warn that achieving the greater good is never simple for those in authority. His first travail involved cementing a peace with the remaining Menite priesthood. Morrow had no desire to drive them from the city or deprive them of their religion. Seeking harmony, he reached an accord. He promised to protect the Menite temples and pay homage to the Creator of man, and lastly, that Thamar would answer for the crime of murdering Hierarch Helatius. Morrow brought his sister before him and told her of what had been agreed upon. Displaying unusual humility, she begged forgiveness for her rash actions. Morrow thought her repentance insincere and exiled her from Caspia, promising death should she ever return. Thus Thamar endured being cast from the city she fought to free, further embittering her to all those who sat in authority, including her brother. As master of the city, Morrow felt driven to expunge evil from its streets and ordered Thamar's followers imprisoned. He sought to exterminate all crime and corruption, a task that proved impossible and prompted increasingly stern measures. While life of the Caspian citizens was improved tremendously under Morrow's wise guidance, many freedoms were curtailed. Living in exile, Thamar spent the next several years pursuing occult studies on the fringes of civilization. She mastered the fundamentals of alchemy, sought shamans of the worm in the wilderness, and tracked down sages of the Black Kingdom of Morrow. She invented her own alphabet and a language called Telgest. though thought to be a key element in her eventual ascension. She also waged her own private war against the Menite priesthood and sought to sow the seeds of dissent in Caspia from afar by contacting those embittered by Morrow's rule. There will be a climactic reunion between the twins in 1894 BR. Thamar returned to Caspia and took charge of an army that rose from within, and those who had governed the city in Morrow's name were murdered in their homes or set upon in the streets. Thamar carved a path of destruction through the city as she made her way to Morrow's palace, displaying terrifying powers over the elements. Those who tried to stop her died, torn apart by fierce winds, set ablaze by dark fire, or pierced by her spear. Buildings around her crumpled to ruin, while behind her the dead rose and set upon the living. Morrow realized the only way he could prevent more harm to his city was to confront her personally. At the outer gates of what would eventually become the Sanctorum, the Sanctium, the twins fought a fierce battle. As Morrow sought to protect the innocents from his sister's unholy power, Thamar taunted him, accusing him of turning into what they had both despised. She pointed out how weak the city had become under his rule, with its people deprived of liberty, and too meek to defend themselves from the hostile world beyond Caspia's walls. In a frenzy of destructive power, she caused the sky to blacken and summoned a storm of smoke and fire that threatened to consume the city. Morrow saw in these final moments how his own choices had led to this, how his unwillingness to forgive had set him down a darker path. As Thamar prepared to destroy all that he had built, he saw the only way to stop her was to sacrifice himself. He stepped forward and accepted the brunt of her wrath. Thamar struck him down in full sight of the gathered throngs. All witnessed as Morrow's flesh became spirit, and he ascended into the sky as the unnatural storm was dispersed by a light brighter than the sun. The power of Morrow's apotheosis stilled the wild air, crumbled the walking dead to dust, and protected those gathered from Thamar's hatred. Empowered by his example and no longer fearing Thamar, the masses overwhelmed her. Rather than using her power to escape, she remained true to her own path, unwilling to submit, and was torn apart by the mob. In death, Thamar too ascended, becoming black smoke that dispersed as she passed into Immoren. All that remained of her was the black pages of her writings. One of Morrow's foremost disciples, a man named Latrice Pardo, collected Thamar's written works intent on destroying them, but an apparition of Morrow manifested and bade him to stop. Morrow told Pardo to bind his own writings with Thamar's. He insisted his sister's words should be preserved alongside his own to illustrate the violation encompassing both of their choices. In her writings were lessons as important to those that would come after as his own. The figure then faded, but his followers did not mourn, knowing Morrow would continue to watch over them from Immoren as a god. The Purging. Morrow and Thamar became symbols of two distinct paths of enlightenment. Word of their respective ascensions spread despite the efforts of the Menite scrutators to repress it. The Menites brought in their hunts, and this became the Purging, a terrible time of religious strife pursued as vigorously as once the Menites had contested with the Mulgore. Entire communities were declared anathema and eradicated, as the fledgling Morrowians were driven into exile. While Morrow's teachings were never entirely expunged from Caspia, the Menite Temple reclaimed leadership of the city in 1882 BR. This was the year that keeper Latrice Pardo was captured, then publicly tortured and executed by the city's scrutators. The original Enchiridion was lost and thought to have been destroyed, although copies had been transcribed by hand and were preserved by priests fleeing the city. Pardo became a hero of the early church as he refused to name any Morrowans. In later centuries, it became a light it became to light that he had hidden the Enchiridion and taken knowledge of its location to his grave. In 1866 BR, a priest named Nolan Orlesius headed Portents that he claimed came from Morrow himself to found a fortified monastery deep within the Wormwall Mountains and dedicated to the preservation of the writings and teachings of the twins. This was the Divinium, with Orlesius becoming the first primarch of the Church of Morrow. Under his direction, the church hierarchy took shape, while its clergy organized efforts to hide the faithful from midnight scrutators. Even as Aurelius was chosen by Morrow, in death the god appeared to usher his soul to the afterlife. Aurelius became the first archon of Morrow, an angelic spirit who would assist the god in Urcaean. A week later, this archon manifested before Aurelius' successor as a sign of Morrow's favor. From that point forward, every primarch after death has become an archon to join a growing host working to fulfill the will of Morrow. After the passing of the old, each new primarch would be signified by a manifestation of one or more archons as an unequivocal sign of Morrow's guiding hand. Morrow was named the Prophet, as through the archons he passed down prophecies to the faithful, as well as other monumentous portents. While the very survival of their faith was tenuous in these early days, the teachings of the twins proved enduring. Thamar's cult spread slowly as Morrow's rose to prominence. The relationship between the faiths would prove to be complex and ever-changing, perhaps reflecting the relationship between the gods themselves. Addendum: The Twins and the War of Souls. According to the Morrowan Church doctrine, the twins established their respective domains in Urcaean after their ascension and joined the War of Souls against each other, as well as Manoff and the Devourer Worm. The exact nature of these conflicts is little understood by mortals, except the periodic battles that are thought to transpire between these divinities and their followers, with the worm being a constant threat to the domains of all gods in Urcaean. The afterlife of all these faiths is described differently, but both Thamarites and Morrowans believe that their souls continue to experience refinement in the hereafter. One degree of piety is thought to affect the likelihood of arriving safely at the domain of one's patron, as well as being welcomed into its community. Thamar's domain is described as relatively welcoming, but also possessing the least secure borders. Manoff's domain is more heavily fortified, but also the most discriminating, while Morrow's domain is between these extremes. Mortal souls periodically contribute to the defense of the realm for their divinities. End addendum. The first ascendants and scions. Morrow and Thamar were followed by others heeding their teachings, who rose to greatness and eventually achieved enlightenment, generally at the moment of death. Those who followed Morrow's path have joined him as ascendants, saint-like figures thought to embody the noblest aspects of the human soul. Those who followed Thamar are scions, deemed holy by their cult but vilified by the majority. The ascendants and scions became essential aspects of the faiths of the twins. The faithful look to these holy beings as patrons and pray to them as intermediaries for Morrow or Thamar. Morrow's first ascendant was a warrior woman of the frozen north named Katharina, a shield maiden of northern birth from the Skirov tribe, who had heard Morrow's message and felt the calling to join the fledgling church at the Divinium. In this time of purging, her martial skill was sorely needed, and she inspired others to take up arms to defend the faith. Katharina protected the church's priests, including those brave enough to spread the teachings despite the midnight scrutators hunting them down. She ultimately died and ascended in 1810 BR, protecting the third primarch, Orestes I, from assassination. At the sight of her ascension, the would-be killers dropped their weapons and begged the primarch's forgiveness, converting to the faith on the spot. In subsequent centuries, many who took up arms in defense of others adopted Katharina's sigil. She would eventually be esteemed by those of noble birth who heeded Morrow's message and sought to honorably fulfill their responsibilities. In life, Thamar had been joined in her occult investigations by Ekris, a man with a brilliant mind and an appetite for lore, who was also her consort and disciple. On word of her ascension, he vowed at once to follow her path and rejoin her in Urkayan. Ekris spent decades retracing her steps and delved into the Telgash glyphs, confirming their connection to the old writings and rituals of Mord. Ekris is said to have used forbidden lore to bargain with infernal powers to greatly extend his mortal life. For more than 100 years he delved into occult mysteries and achieved this vow. He ascended after his death in 1780 BR to become Thamar's first scion. Ekris is prayed to by those seeking enlightenment through forbidden lore. Other exceptional individuals would rise to ascension, but not always predictably. The next scion was a witch named Delise, who spent her lifetime terrorizing Menite temples through necronomic arts. While rightly reviled, Delise's attacks served to protect the early Morrowian faith. Her dark ascension was in 1610 BR, her death self-inflicted by falling upon a black sword. Scion Delise became a patron of necromancers, as well as those rebelling against tyranny. In 1590 BR, a woman named Elena ascended to join Morrow after spending decades traveling, spreading the Morrowian faith across western Immoren. Another selfless Morrowian paragon named Dolef sought enlightenment, negotiating the Medirius. He is remembered for rescuing those caught amid the storms of the dangerous waters of that area. He ascended in 1411 BR and gained a strong following among fishermen, sailors, and riverboatmen who prayed to him in hopes of safe journey. Demonstrating that not all followers of the goddess were as openly sinister as Ekris or Delise was the unexpected ascension of Scion Darcy in 1400 BR, a prodigious and influential noble of early Thuria, who had elevated his township to regional power through ruthless politics and fostering trade. While openly condemned for his corruption, many subsequent sovereigns looked to Darcy's example and treated his writings as the guide of pragmatic rulership. Over the centuries, more ascendants and scions would arise to strengthen their respective faiths. These holy missionaries are thought to manifest periodically on Cain to guide mortals. Ascendants work primarily through dreams and visions, while scions prefer to possess mortals and control their bodies to further their schemes on Cain. The Wars of the North and the Fall of Mord. While in the south, the rise of the twins led to religious purges, the cards were at war in the north. The teachings of the twins would eventually reach the northern lands as well, but spread more gradually over the centuries, facilitating accords between old and new religions. By 1690 BR, lands just south of the Nashtharth Mountains saw sporadic outbreaks of armed conflict between the warlords of the Cossites, Skivrov, and the southern Cardic horse lords. Kos never managed to unify as a kingdom, though its people were fierce in battle and especially dangerous in their native Skarsfell forests. The Skivrov had turned as zealous to the Menite faith as they had once howled to the moons to pray to the worm, and were mountain fighters without peer. Yet when the Skivrov armies marched onto the plains to meet the Cardic forces, they were ridden down by heavy horses. These battles may have continued indeterminately if a terrible plague had not swept through both the Skivrov and Cossites, mysteriously leaving the Cards untouched. The Cards were able to use this advantage to siege huge stretches of land. Among the cities conquered by the Cards were Moga, that they called Kardov, in veneration of Kardovik. The kingdom of Morrow, now in decline, was torn apart by internal strife and wars abroad. An internal power struggle left the kingdom weak and ruled by madmen who antagonized their neighbors in a time when the people were desperate to rebuild. Lacking the funds to pay for their wars, the lords of Morrow committed an unforgivable blasphemy by ordering the plunder of several burial sites in northern Midgard to bolster their failing treasury. This galvanized the Midgard against them, and soon these two kingdoms became locked in a bitter struggle. Morrow had become diminished within the dark forest and valleys of its interior, its military strength a shadow of what it once was. While its lords possessed dread powers, these did not suffice to allow it to endure lengthy wars of attrition against the Midgard with their fertile farmlands and abundant population. The Midgard would eventually become a bastion of the Morrowian faith, and so the fall of Morrow by 1500 BR was seen by most as a Morrowian triumph over an ancient evil that plagued these lands for more than 2,000 years. The scattered descendants of Morrow became Morrodanes, who have never been since scorned or have been since treated with scorn and treated with suspicion. The destruction of Morrow gave other neighboring kingdoms the opportunity to consolidate under strong lords. Slowly but inexorably, the 1,000 cities became apportioned off and divided by borders of growing kingdoms. The kingdom of Thuria rose to dominance in the west, initially banding together for mutual protection against the Trollkin of the Gnarls. While the Midgard remained only loosely confederated and never formalized central rulership, their communities made pacts of mutual solidarity, eventually coming to be known as the Midlands. North of Thuria and south of the Cardic Plains rose the kingdom of Tordor. By 1443 BR, Cardove was the largest city in the north and began to exercise its dominance over neighboring territories, gaining seized from Kos and the Skirov, led by the young and charismatic Skirnov Skelvero, to declare himself emperor, founding the first Cardic Empire. The Kos were the first to fall. The last of the Kos nobles finally surrendered to the emperor in 1382 BR. A number of other proud horse lords dwelling east of the Cardove refused to bow to the emperor, claiming their lineage descended directly was from the priest King Cardovic himself. In the last of these years, the now elderly Emperor Skelvoro proved his political acumen by persuading the horse lords that they could join and serve the empire without bowing to his rule, accrediting them as princes in their own right. Thus assuaged, and with the Cardic horse lords united, the empire waged a long war against Skirov. Skelvoro's successor eventually forced the Skirov from their mountain strongholds, and the Skirov joined the Cardic Empire in 1263 BR, bringing the Mennonite faith to the mountain communities. The emperor wisely allowed the region to be governed by Mennonite priests, freeing his own vassals to engage in battle elsewhere. Eventually, the Morrowian faith gained a foothold. The people of this region had long shown a predilection towards faith and zealotry, whichever god they embraced. Mirroring the wars of the north, Tordor fought with Thuria in 1322 BR and annexed the rival kingdom by 1313. Thuria remained largely intact, and her citizens continued proudly to call themselves Thurians, even as their leaders swore oaths of fealty to the Tordorian Castellans. With Thurian strength behind her, Tordor became a rising power, particularly notable for a formidable fleet of Durgan-mist ships that dominated Immoren's western coasts. One of the last of the northern peoples to defy the Cardic Empire was the eastern horse lords, who in 1169 BR united under the Zapeshis, Umbracosts, and Chardovsis to create the Kingdom of Umbre, which declared itself independent from the empire. Korska became their capital and began to arm and fortify in anticipation of war. Their position was strengthened through ties of commerce and trade with the lowland peoples settling in a fertile region northeast of the Thornwood, which became the kingdom of Rhinar in 1073 BR. Reconciliation of faiths. The purging conducted by the Mennonites against the Morrowians was at its most brutal in the early centuries of the Thousand Cities era. Early Morrowians knew that they must worship in secret anywhere the Secrutators held sway. Morrowian shrines and churches were hidden or disguised. Mennonite temples were filled with secret worshippers of the twins. The rise of other Ascendants and Scions continued to draw converts. Morrowian numbers in some regions made it difficult for the Secrutators to actively repress the Prophet's followers from a fear of widespread unrest. This was particularly true when the Morrowian faith took root amongst the sons and daughters of the ruling families. Amid this time of religious strife lived a Morrowian soldier and chaplain named Sullivan, a healer versed in alchemy and battlefield surgery, who felt the calling to walk the war-torn city-states of Thuria. He earned such a reputation for his dedication to saving lives that even the Mennonite priests refrained from interfering in his work. In 1253 BR, after spending years tending to the wounded of myriads of conflicts, his help was beseeched by the steward of a small fiefdom south of Thuria. This steward's master, King Eldarin, had apparently fallen prey to a strange illness. Sullivan discovered King Eldarin had been unwillingly given himself over to the scion Rimmel, one of Thamar's most malicious servants. The king's possessed body was serving to incubate a terrible plague that would be unleashed upon the region. Sullivan attempted to sanctify the body to free the king's soul, but failed. He realized his only chance of success would be to lure the scion Rimmel into his own flesh, and held him there, suffering horribly as disease racked his body, but containing it in the process. At his death, scion Rimmel and his plague were destroyed, while Sullivan ascended to join Morrow. Sullivan became the patron of Morrowian healers, while the Thamarites in subsequent years exorcised all records of Rimmel, claiming no true scion would have been destroyed in this fashion. Despite these and other miracles, the Mennonite temples still refused to acknowledge the divinity of the twins. The first inroads towards an accord between these embittered religions was taken place shortly after Sullivan's ascension, when a Mennonite delegation was invited to meet Morrowian leaders at the Divinium. Though they accepted this invitation, the Mennonites were not disposed towards an accord, and in fact harbored amongst them those plotting to kill the Morrowian Primarch. This included the infamous assassin Corva, a devout Thamarite. She had accepted a contract to murder the Primarch after seeing visions from the Darker Twin. Taking the place of a masked Secrutator, Secrutius, she joined the delegation. Amid these negotiations, Corva was able to get close enough to Primarch Lorelakis to strike him down. While she succeeded in murdering the Morrowian Primarch on holy ground, this set into motion an unprecedented chain of divine manifestations. Ascended Katarina appeared in a blaze of silver light to avenge the Primarch's death, and killed Corva. As the shocked and amazed delegates looked on, Thamar appeared to claim Corva's soul, as she in turn ascended herself. Katarina and Thamar seemed poised to do battle when Morrow manifested to gather the soul of his Primarch, now becoming an Archon. These divinities clashed briefly before both sides vanished in a blinding flash. In the aftermath, the Council of Visigoths were assembled, and doctrine was written in 1247 BR to explain these events to the satisfaction of the Mennonite temples. These measures allowed the Mennonites to reach a grudging accord with the Morrowian faith. They determined that the Menoth had allowed Morrow's divinity by way of an accommodation whereby Morrow knelt to Menoth as his creator. Morrow is said to have been given sanction to shepherd those who worshipped him, so as long as he stood as guardian against those petrified of his sister. Further, His followers were required to acknowledge the Creator, attend midnight services, and pay tithes to the temple. This theological accommodation allowed Morrowians to worship openly and to build churches towards their faith.